While the media would like you to believe that everyone in the US is at each other's throats over the election and domestic politics, Democrat versus Republican, red versus blue, it's a rare phenomenon that there is one thing bringing both sides of the spectrum under one roof. And that thing is China. We've always hoped that China would change. Liberalize, democratize, hell, just even be less bad. Hey, we even sent over a US president to formalize ties with a brutal dictatorship, forever cementing its power and position in the world. Thanks, Nixon. Anyway, let me all catch you up on how we ended up with this disaster. But first, this episode is brought to you by Bespoke Post. Bespoke Post is a subscription box which gives you a ton of choices on really, really cool items and products. I got sent a couple. This one I particularly like, which is called Parlor. I like this one because it's a nice little place to serve my whiskey. I could pretend like I'm in the 70s, Every 70s show had like a decanter and a random decanter of whiskey and 2 glasses. It's really cool that you can get these under the radar brands and you get it delivered to your house every single month. But if you don't like the box, you can actually send it back and modify it to your heart's content. So you get all kinds of cool stuff. Not only did I get this cool whiskey box, I also got sent this weekender bag, which is pretty cool. The thing is, if you're not interested in any of that, there's a ton of boxes to choose from, so it's really cool that you can customize them. It's not just a surprise every single month. You can try it out risk-free. Don't forget to go to bespokepost.com and use the code LAOY20 to try it out. Thanks. China's had 5 leaders since it decided to go down the dark path of communism with no actual social benefits, or socialism with Chinese characteristics, as they like to call it. First one, and this is just in 1949, so not ancient history, was Mao Zedong, or Chairman Mao. The original creator of this madness was obsessed with China competing with the Soviet Union. Back when communism was oh so cool. So much so that his main aspiration was to, at all costs, hit those quotas. You see, my man Mao loved his quotas. Grain quotas, steel quotas, killing landlord quotas. Doesn't matter what quota, Mao was on top of it. You see, Mao started his tyrannical bonanza in 1949, and his failed policies led to the deforestation of the entire country, which you can see today, with those organized trees everywhere. If you've been to China, you'll know what I'm talking about. He did that to fuel the backyard furnaces to hit those steel quotas, and when people were burning their kitchen utensils to make useless pig iron, Mao was bragging to the Soviet Union that China too could make steel. Food production quotas were always met because everyone was scared as hell to tell their superior otherwise due to the brutal punishment system that Mao had created, so cheating on these quotas was super rampant. The ladder system of power has always made it a situation where no one in China wants to be liable for the next guy's mistake. Unfortunately, meeting all of these quotas meant that Mao was more than happy to export all of the real food and grain to the Soviet Union. And while his fat ass gloated while he stuffed his face with pork belly and his harem of little girls, 45 million people, and yes, I mean million, people died in just 4 years. Guys, this is only 1962 when the famine ended. This is not ancient history. And if you can see, a lot of this has to do with the fact that Mao just wanted the Soviet Union to respect him. There's a whole problem with Chinese face culture, the whole idea that you need to impress other people, and that's more important than actual wealth or actual success. And unfortunately, it usually relies on the fact that China really still looks up to or even worships the Western world. Mao also hated China. He hated Chinese culture, so he had it destroyed. Temples, relics, hell, even the language. He tried to remove Chinese characters altogether to replace them with a Western alphabet. But thankfully, he only destroyed Chinese characters by instituting the simplified character system, which makes mainland Chinese language look like a Walmart equivalent compared to the traditional Chinese use in Hong Kong or Taiwan. Seriously, it's just straight up off-brand. Anyways, thankfully this bastard died, but not without ensuring that China was not only destroyed during his rule, but in the future as well. I love how the guy that hated China so much so as to destroy its entire identity and culture is still worshipped as the hero of China today. And his fat face is still on every Chinese R&B as well. Deng Xiaoping, the second guy, or you might know him as the short dude that smokes on American news programs, he was attributed with allowing China to open up and get rich. He also starred in a brilliant video game. He's often looked at as the savior of Mao's errors. However, this is a fallacy, because both the victims and the victors of Mao's horrific policies were, in fact, just the Chinese people, not the Chinese Communist Party. However, the CCP never seems to want people to know that. In fact, it was just the Chinese people that pulled themselves out of poverty. Anyway, Deng was not too happy with Mao, since Mao had him slaving away in labor camps for years. And he also knew that China was going to continue being a poor wasteland unless it participated in this little thing called capitalism. Deng allowed special economic zone cities to start up and experiment with Western company cooperation. You see, the fact that Western companies were allowed to show up and utilize Chinese labor is the reason Chinese people stopped being poor. And also the fact that Chinese people are not lazy and very hardworking. They were actually allowed to participate in a system where they were allowed to make money. And guess what? They did. Soon, companies from all over the world were keen to rush into China to take advantage of its cheap labor. This allowed a certain tier of people in China to get pretty damn wealthy. But, and I'll say this many more times, the framework of the brutal authoritarianism was still there. Nothing, and I repeat, nothing had changed. It's just that more Chinese people had some money now. You don't believe me? Well, Deng Xiaoping is the one that pulled the trigger on the Tiananmen Square protests. You know, in 1989, the one where the students wanted a free and democratic China. You know, the ones that were thinking outside the box and said, hey, why don't we not do this brutal, tyrannical thing? Deng has the blood of over 10,000 students on one day on his hands, when he ordered China's own army to murder its own people. Not to mention the purge of mass arrests that followed and still haunt people to this day. You see, the aftermath, the hangover of the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests means that no one wants to speak out anymore. Sure, under Deng Xiaoping, China was changing, but the framework for a brutal authoritarian government was still there. But hey, at least there were still term limits. Fast forward to Jiang Zemin, or as you may know him for his outbursts in English or his resemblance to an amphibian.
You are the last major communist dictatorship in the world.
You mean I'm dictatorship?
Well, of course. A developmental dictatorship is what we believe it is. Am I wrong?
Of course. This is big mistake.
Jiang still actually retains a lot of his power today in his faction within the CCP. Either way, him and his successor, Hu Jintao, chilled out without much worry. You see, Deng had taken care of a lot of the dissent, and the Chinese government knew that if it was to stop further dissent, all the people had to do was have more money and more food than in the past. That was enough to keep people quiet. Both of these leaders, Jiang and Hu, are seen as rather weak, as they didn't take advantage of the more visual of powers, like crackdowns and mass starvation and, a thing called genocide. Sure, they had their fair share of crackdowns, like banning Falun Gong, which is that breathing exercise that people were so into back then, suppressing Tibetans and people in Xinjiang, but by and large, Chinese people had had enough, and making money and improving their living standards was enough to quiet things down for a long time. Although these two leaders amassed power and exercised some aspects of the brutal regime, it paled in comparison to Mao and even Deng. This gave America and the rest of the West hope for China. It can only continue getting better, right? This was China's golden period. But then again, the framework for a brutal authoritarian government was still there. I would know. I lived in China for a decade during that very golden period. And I watched China silently grow. You see, this is where China screwed up. China had a really good thing going, hiding in the background, attracting foreign investment, slowly biding its time to achieve middle income status and then chill out in its authoritarian fashion, giving its citizens a little taste of freedom here and there, enough to satiate them to keep the central government in power. By that token, China's always gotten a free pass from the West, because as inhumane as the government acts, it's always been out of self-preservation. The only thing that the Chinese government cares about is keeping its rule. The CCP has little reason to survive in this day and age. I mean, it's a communist government that offers little to no freedom for its citizens, and at the same time, also offers them little to no social programs. So what's the point? The only reason it survives is to protect its nearly 100 million strong membership. And guess what? Most people in other countries don't care. Go ahead and do your thing, China. Most people in other countries are apathetic and complacent if it has nothing to do with them or their country. You can be as evil as you want to your own people. Then let's go to the fifth leader, the current leader, Xi Jinping, or as you might know him, Winnie the Pooh. Xi deletes term limits, and that's the very thing that kept chaos at bay. You see, China looks like a country where it has a one-party state, and that's very true. But within that one party, there's a lot of infighting. There's a lot of power struggles. And those things keep things a little more sane. It's a very small semblance of a pseudo-democracy that is very much self-appointed, but at least it stops tyrannical dictators from going all out. Xi goes on to declare the West China's main enemy, especially America. He stokes up nationalism, ramps up neo-colonialism with the Belt and Road Project, really pissing off a lot of countries around the world. He goes all out in public with aggressive ambitions on Taiwan and land grabs in the South China Sea. He shuts down the internet even more to Chinese people than it already was. But he ramps up the delusional soft power on Western platforms that promotes its brutal and oppressive system. He goes on to buy up world institutions like the UN and the WHO, and then covers up a pandemic that brings the world into economic ruin and kills millions of people. And now the Chinese government wonders why the world is upset with it. Gee willikers, I wonder why. Anyway, during that silently growing period, we had all hoped that China would liberalize and join the rest of the developed world. Yeah, sometimes it takes some turmoil and some bullshit to get there, but in the end, if you treat everyone else pretty well, you can hang out with the big boys. Turns out the schematic never changed. The framework for an authoritarian dictatorship was always there. Our hopes and dreams for a democratic China couldn't have ever happened because that framework on how Mao molded the country never changed. The monster, the absolute beast of an authoritarian dictatorship that we see today was always lurking underneath. It just needed a brutal leader like Winnie the Pooh himself to consolidate enough power to really unleash its true potential. And here we are in 2021, licking our wounds from the current pandemic and scrambling to figure out how we let the Chinese government get this far into our systems. We are only just understanding how deep it's gotten, and our greed and the fact that we are complicit in this is largely on us. Today, we're self-censoring our movies, TV shows, articles, education system, and nearly every facet of life so as not to upset the Chinese government. The authoritarian dictatorship that literally has modern-day concentration camps. That's what happens when the Communist Party of China has entered private businesses, swooned politicians, bought public institutions, purchased and infiltrated infrastructure, silenced all of its critics, and exported its seductive surveillance state model, all while writing its own narrative on past, present, and future. I've given my adult life to China. I see what it is, what it was, and what it could have been. So forgive my very real motivation for wanting to see the world wake up to what's happening. I may not be able to influence what's happening in China, but I can tell you what. This isn't going to keep going on in my own country. Not on my watch.